older managerial cohort believes that journalism is not a profession, it's still a craft. It's expensive to do news in a responsible way.
Self-cleaning oven. The late and great David Carr called the internet the self-cleaning oven of journalism, basically saying Twitter critics will keep journalists accountable. But who are these people on Twitter? Now the top editors from CNN and New York Times are telling their journalists to get off Twitter because it perpetuates the echo chamber where journalists are living in silos and becoming more and more radical. It is an oven, but who knows how well it cleans?
When David said this, and I met him a few years ago, he came up to Toronto to speak to a journalistic group, and he used that phrase, and we thought, oh, that's really clever. But then when you think about it, I'm not sure that that the internet works in that way. The theory is, and a lot of media managers believe this, and may still believe it as far as I know, that we don't need editorial smarts. We need the internet. There was a meeting of publishers in Toronto with the publishers of the three biggest newspapers in Canada, the Toronto Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and Montreal's La Presse. And I asked them, what's the future of journalism now? Where do you see newspapers going? And all three of them said, it's digital, 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 and more digital. And because they see it partly as a way to economize, to make their newsrooms operate more quickly, more efficiently. And as a recovering news manager myself, I always thought, well, how can we make sure that people are working not to overcapacity, but to their best capacity? And so there was a time, maybe 5-6 years ago, where and before that, where news managers said, you know, that internet, this is going to be the way in which we can get rid of older, more expensive employees, hire younger people with digital smarts who can post stuff constantly because that's the way they live, and we'll be better for it. And the problem hasn't proven to be true. The issue for media organizations is compounded because it's expensive to do news in a responsible way. You could put someone in a radio studio and have that person bloviate over a number of issues. It's much more expensive to create a foreign bureau covering the war in Ukraine. That is very expensive.
So you're sort of saying that in the beginning, when David Carr said that, it was sort of the idea that this plethora of different voices and thoughts on the internet would really be much better critics than having one or two very experienced journalists critique the coverage. But now we're having basically very young journalists who have not had all of that experience. On top of that, are then every day getting sort of influenced by the people who are critiquing them. So they're essentially influencing the coverage.
That's exactly right. That's perfect. I think what we're seeing now is that news organizations have said, okay, we need to do the right thing by our audiences. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we have to hire young, because young people know more than older people do. And then they can bring all of these digital skills into our news organization. That's going to be a good thing. And we want to hire people, young people, who more accurately reflect the audiences, the public that we serve, so that many news organizations have done a great job in the 1980s and 90s in hiring more women when there were accusations that news organizations were full of older white men. They said, you're right, let's hire more women, and more women were hired. And now they've come into a level of managerial excellence. A lot of news organizations, not all of them, but a lot of them are now run by women. Fine. What's happened more recently is that the idea of having a more diverse newsroom, a more diverse media organization, where you have journalists of color, you have issues around gender and sexuality, and the idea that these young people will bring a new way of perceiving journalism. And so a lot of news organizations have become much more diverse, which is a very good thing. But, and here's the interesting thing for me anyway, is that older managerial cohort believes that journalism is not a profession, it's still a craft. That is to say, you come into a newsroom, you're a young person, you learn the skills, you learn what the culture of the place is, you have a lot of really lousy shifts, you do stories that you're being handed by your assignment editor, and eventually you reach a level of competence where you feel comfortable asserting your own editorial judgment inside the news organization. Young people now are saying, I'm not going to wait for that. I'm here, I've got a degree from Columbia or the University of Toronto, and you're not listening to me, and I have ideas about what is important for the people that I know about. So we have a generation gap inside many, many news organizations where you have the older managerial class saying, be patient, you'll learn, and you'll be fine. And we have this younger cohorts, some of whom call themselves resistance journalists, because they're not willing to wait. They want their reality now. And so they're pushing very strongly for it. And it's creating a lot of tension inside news organizations. I'll give you one example. The Toronto Star, which is a kind of left liberal newspaper in Toronto, it's been around for 150 years. It's a long tradition of social justice, et cetera, very much part of the Methodist Church tradition. Not that they were openly religious, but they had that kind of social awareness. And they have been very good about hiring people, and especially young people, and a diverse newsroom exists at the Toronto Star. For the national elections, the federal elections in Canada, the Toronto Star has what they call editorial boards, where they invite the leaders of the parties, and there are 4 or 5 parties, 2 or 3 of them are significant, but they always invite the leaders to come to an editorial board meeting at the Toronto Star, that it's open, everything's on the record, and it's open to anyone at the Toronto Star to come in and throw questions at the leaders. So the Prime Minister came, the leader of the opposition, the head of the Conservative Party came, the head of the Socialist Party came, and then they invited a new, more right-wing, anti-immigration party called the People's Party of Canada. There's some residents here in America as well. And the leader of that party was invited in, and he came to the editorial board. And the young journalists at the Toronto Star boycotted that meeting because they said, we're not going to give this guy any oxygen. We think he's a racist, we think he's anti-immigrant, and we're not going to sit in the same room as him. And the older editors, managers said, well, wait a minute. Your job as journalists is also to engage with ideas and with people with whom you may disagree. And so boycotting doesn't work. Anyway, to me, that was a moment of truth, a moment of Zen, as it were, that the Toronto Star suddenly acknowledged the fact that there are 2 cultures struggling inside the newsroom for oxygen themselves. It's a very complicated situation. And it's not just at the Toronto Star. The New York Times has had this problem. NPR has had this problem. The Wall Street Journal has had this problem. So,
yeah, wearing your bias on your sleeve.
Well, yeah, and as Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel wrote in the Elements of Journalism, journalists should not leave their conscience at the door when they come into work, that their conscience, their awareness should inform their journalism, but not deform their journalism. How do you strike that balance? And that's one of the things that I've been engaging with my students about. How do you balance your powerful belief in something, yet do it in a way that is fair to your audience? That, to me, is the critical choice.